much. Gennady Estraikh. I first met Gennady, I think it was 20 years ago. He came to Nottingham to talk about Yiddish. He lives now in America, he teaches at New York University, and is the author and editor of several books on Yiddish. Intensive Yiddish, Yiddish on the Left, and only this week he has been involved in an international seminar on the work of Der Meester, one of the writers involved in the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. Please welcome Gennady Estraikh.
Thanks so much. Just one footnote. I live in England. Yes. I teach in New York, but I live in England. And it is really remarkable to see so many people today. And for a while, I was sure that the whole story of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee and Yiddish writers executed on that day or other days already became a sort of a water under the bridge. But today I realize that it's not the case. And I know that similar events organized today, because given the difference in time zones, it will be a bit later, in New York, in Boston, in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, as far as I know. And I know that today is the same in Wales, in Hamburg, yes, and it will be today in Moscow, and a few days ago, of course, in Jerusalem, from what I didn't know. It is hardly a coincidence, strictly speaking, that the information came out in this communist or former communist newspaper. In Russia, they were punished by translating articles from this communist newspaper. It was the only newspaper that were allowed to use for our classes of English. So we knew a lot about miners and so on. And again, it can be seen as a coincidence, but there is some logic. Because in 1956, when for the first time the information about August 1952 became available, and first it became available in the Yiddish newspaper in New York Forwards, and immediately it was recycled and retold in the New York Times and many other newspapers. And of course, people in the left didn't believe, and who would believe the Forwards, and who would believe the New York Times, and who would believe the Daily Mail, yeah, that it was at 1 o'clock announced. So it was important that in the beginning of April 1956, an article was published in the Warsaw Yiddish newspaper, Volksstimme, and because it was Warsaw, because it was a communist country, and of course at that time the newspaper itself was published under the auspices of the Polish Communist Party, it became clear that really this August 1952 took place, it really happened, though in the Soviet Union itself. The information about August 1952 and generally about the case of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee was a sort of classified until 1986. As late as 1986, it became legal. The censorship would allow to release information, to release an article, to release any publication mentioning August 1952 and mentioning the case of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. Why I'm coming back to this Morning Star issue? Because initially, in 1956 and later, and more or less till the beginning of the 70s, this sort of memorial events would be organized only or almost exclusively by left-wingers, by those who used to be communists or were around the communist movement, but under the influence, under the impact of the revelations about Stalinism and about the executions, particularly of Jewish writers, they became former communists. But it was a very strange kind of former communists. They were former communists, but they believed that they were real communists. They were former in the sense that they moved out from non-critical perception of the events in the Soviet Union. But they believed that they were real Leninists. They were against Stalin. Stalin was wrong. But Lenin was always right. And the crowd of people who believed in Lenin, to them it was an important event. This August 1952, it became on a regular basis for a long period of time. It was confined to this circle. Other Yiddish circles, including socialist circles, but not circles of, strictly speaking, right socialists, they didn't believe that it was right to organize such events, because in their mind it was a tragedy. But in a sense it was self-inflicted. There were people who 100% devoted to communism. Peres Markish, David Bergelsson, Leif Kvitka, Itzhak Pfeffer, and David Hofstein. And as a result of their devotion, they became part of this system, and they suffered from the hands of this system. So as a result, they didn't see any reason to organize. And there were discussions, numerous articles published on this topic in the Yiddish, especially in the Yiddish press. The situation became different as a landmark. It was 1972. 1972, there was a congress in Jerusalem on Yiddish-related issues, and this congress later created an organization that was called in Yiddish Weltrat for Yiddish and Yiddish Kultur, the World Council for Yiddish and Yiddish Culture. And the decision was, okay, 20 years after the events, really, it's water under the bridge, I mean, the communist affiliation of Peres Markish and all other people, and we'll start marking this day on a regular basis every August. So beginning from 1972, it became universally somehow commemorated in various links, various sectors of Jewish life. There was also, of course, a significant preparation to this 1972 event. It was important to reevaluate, to repackage, and to rethink this whole case of Yiddish writers. Not just to decide, okay, enough, and now we're going to look differently at them. Therefore, first of all, it was important that usually August became the moment of recalling, of speaking, of publishing only about 5 people executed on that day. Because in August 1952, on that day, the 12th of August 1952, 13 people were executed, and only 5 of them were writers. But as a result, someone created this powerful, actually, image of the night of murdered Yiddish writers. But it was the night, I don't know exactly whether it was night, but it was the day when 13 people were murdered. And 8 of them, as a result of this sort of a change, a shift, became less significant or not significant at all. Next step, it was important to create a new image for the 5 writers. And it's very interesting how in the climate of the Cold War, in the climate, in general political climate of the time, the writings of Peres Markish, David Bergelsson, and so on became dissected and reinterpreted. That everything that smelled with nationalism was praised. It is wonderful. And it wasn't clear, actually, whether they were really nationalists. My opinion that they were not nationalists, they were really devoted communists. But with these changes, it became possible to repackage it. And I know this information more or less firsthand from one of the scholars who played a central role in this repackaging. Professor Honesh Meruk, who told me in Oxford, when he was teaching in Oxford, how it was difficult to raise money for publishing their stories, for publishing their poems. It was important to convince foundations, it was important to convince individuals that they were victims of the regime, really victims of the regime, rather than just, it was the situation that So what sort, because the title is, I have to reveal the secret, yes? Why the war, really? In 1941, when the first steps were undertaken to create the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, and it's important to understand that it was one of a few committees created around the time. And they were created as propaganda units under the umbrella, under the auspices of the Soviet Foreign Office. So it was the structure, the Soviet Foreign Office. Under the Soviet Foreign Office, there was a department of information. It was called Sofinform Bureau, and the Sofinform Bureau generated information and was responsible for spreading information of the events in the Soviet Union, among France, and so on. And under the structure of Sofinform Bureau, there were a few committees responsible for some specific propaganda. Jewish propaganda is the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. There was a propaganda for various Slavic groups. There was a Pan-Slavic committee. There was a committee of Soviet scholars that targeted specifically the academic community and so on. For women, a separate organization. Now, of course, it sounds as a committee, a sort of a unit in civil society. Yes, society, to create some Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee like in many countries. In the Soviet Union, the notion of civil society didn't exist. It disappeared. Though the Russian Jewish society, by the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, was incredibly strong and incredibly well developed, of various kinds, from a society, from groups to help a poor girl to get a husband, to a group responsible for a library, to an organization, I loved especially this organization, to provide poor families with a chicken for Friday evening, to an organization that was responsible for savings and loan, some associations. It was one of the most common form of civic society organizations in Jewish life in Russia. And right after 1917, the Soviet regime began to suppress any forms of civil society, Jewish and non-Jewish. But we're speaking now about Jewish. It took some time. Some of the organizations were simply suppressed, phased out or whatever. Some organizations became communist organizations, and essentially they stopped being organizations of civil society. They became part of the whole apparatus with the veneer of being an element of civil society. And we find in the Soviet period how skillfully the regime would create these ostensibly civic society organizations. Recently, maybe some of you remember from the 80s and 90s, there was a committee, an anti-Zionist committee in the Soviet Union. But the anti-Zionist committee later in the 80s and the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee in the 40s were committees of people appointed to the committees. It wasn't that I, Gennady Estraikh, want to be a member of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee or the Zionist, God forbid, the Anti-Zionist Committee or something else. There were people carefully selected, vetted by various units. It included, of course, the Secret Service, and also partly populated by reliable people. For example, the first responsible secretary of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, there was a person called Gennady Estraikh, an experienced agent of the Comintern, who was dispatched to the United States to establish the communist press in Yiddish in the United States. Later he came to the Soviet Union. One was reappeared in the 30s in France and the United States already as a spy. And then he managed to come back, and with this experience he was appointed as the secretary of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. So there were also a few guys, the former representative or master spy in San Francisco who came and was also appointed. But the bulk of them were people, writers. Why writers? Because by that time, and in the process of liquidating independent Jewish life, people were also liquidated. Jewish leaders didn't have a chance to survive in the Soviet Union by 1941. Really Jewish activists. They either were likely to emigrate, or in a sense were likely to die. Otherwise, they ended up either being purged in the 30s, or being executed in the 30s. They didn't exist anymore. Or maybe somewhere hidden, they were not visible. And there were no Jewish organizations by that time. The only organization that survived legally as a Jewish organization, I'm not speaking about Yiddish theaters, they're also important, were units, Jewish units at the Writers' Union, at the Soviet Writers' Union. Somehow it survived. And by 1941, there were 3 sections of Yiddish writers in the Soviet Writers' Union. One of them in Moscow, another in Kiev, and there was also a unit in Belarus at that time, in Minsk. So they were really officially the Jewish sections at the Soviet Writers' Union, legally not only possible and accepted, but many of them were decorated and praised by the Soviet regime. Peres Malkish had the highest Soviet decoration, the Order of Lenin, in 1939. And he received this decoration, and it was the highest and the only Soviet Yiddish writer decorated so high. Some other writers were also highly decorated. Itzhak Pfeffer had an order, Leib Kvitka was highly decorated. Some people were really, they were not really confined, or many of them were not confined in the Yiddish circles. Leib Kvitka, for example, became one of the most popular Soviet children's poets. Not Soviet Jewish children's poets, but Soviet poets. Whole generations. I grew up reading, or my parents would read, poems by Leib Kvitka, translated into Russian, translated into Ukrainian. I believe that total, I don't remember how many millions copies were published. If I'm not wrong, altogether 12 million copies of his books appeared in the Soviet Union, predominantly, of course, not in Yiddish. So they were part of the general Soviet cultural establishment. And as a result, it was logical to appoint to a propaganda unit such people, especially as the main purpose, and actually the only purpose of this propaganda unit, was to generate articles, to generate material, and for distributing this material for the press in various countries. So it was also a unit with translators into English, into French, into Hebrew, into various languages, and many newspapers would get it ready to consume in the language of this or that particular outlet. And step by step, this ostensibly civic society unit began to transform into something else. And the main moment of this transformation was associated with a trip, with a journey of 2 representatives of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, its chairman, Solomon Shlomo Michoels, the director of the Yiddish theater in Moscow, and the poet Itzhak Pfeffer. In 1943, they spent a few months traveling in the United States, Mexico, Canada, and this place. in the autumn of 1943, they came to England and spent some time in England. And it was very successful. Successful, and at the same time, during this trip, something very important happened. That in the beginning of the journey, Michoels was an artist, a director, and Estraikh Pfeffer was a poet. And when they came back, they realized and they could feel that they became statesmen. Because everywhere the reception was, in the United States, in England, and the questions to them, one of the questions, dear comrade Estraikh Pfeffer, what are you writing at the moment? Or dear Mr. Michoels, what sort of plays are you planning to put or to stage in your theater? Sometimes yes, but the bulk of the questions were questions loaded with politics. What kind of Jewish life is going to be in the Soviet Union after the war? What sort of an attitude the Soviet government would have or had at that time to the establishment of Israel, and so on and so forth. So the questions wanted to a writer and to an artist, but the questions were to representatives and essentially ostensibly representatives of the Jewish community of the Soviet Union that wasn't organized. Michoels and Pfeffer were not people dispatched by Jews of the Soviet Union. There were people selected for this mission, and they represented this unit, the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. But they came as people with a mission, and they remained on this mission virtually till the end of their life. Very important that during their trip to the United States, an issue was raised about the establishment of a Jewish republic in the Crimea. There was such a project. In 1926, it started even earlier, but in 1926, it took a form of creating a Jewish republic in the Crimea. It is better known about Repression, but Repression, the whole project started in 1928. But in 1926, people were speaking seriously about the Crimea. The Crimea sounded better than Repression. It was more or less next door, but it wasn't as good as it sounds. It wasn't really that someone was going to give to this republic such places as Yalta or Sevastopol. No way. The question was about allocating the northern part of the Crimean peninsula that was a horrible and remains quite a horrible place. That look, go and try to do something in this area. And they went, and thanks to American money, altogether it was about $10 million of that time invested in this exercise. It was really a successful project. It was successful, but it was at the same time claustrophobic. Not enough place. Therefore, eventually they decided to go to Repression, where there was too much place. Yeah? And it was also another reason that it was surrounded by Ukrainians, German. At that time, there was still a significant German farming contingent in the area and so on. They were unhappy. They were unhappy that suddenly, in the heart of this place, a Jewish republic was in the making. So the project somehow slowed down. It was not phased out completely during the Soviet period, but only two urban districts remained by 1941. One was called Freidorf district, and another one was called Leyendorf district, mainly populated by Jewish farmers, successful farmers. There's literature about significant purpose of literature. So during the trip in 1943, in conversations with representatives of the American Jewish establishment, there was this penny dropped. Let's come back to the project. Especially what they were discussing was 1943 after Stalingrad and It was very strong belief that the Red Army would succeed in the war. So let's start thinking about this post-war situation and how horrible and difficult it would be for Jews to come back to their places of pre-war residence, to come to a place, to a grave. So let's make it possible to give them an alternative. And let's come back. So they came back with this idea. And there's a saying or there was a saying in the Soviet Union that any initiative is punishable. And initiative was supposed to come from the authorities. And any initiative was punishable in the same way as any civil society organization was out of question. It was impossible to have. And suddenly, the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee came out with this initiative of a geopolitical importance, actually, of creating a republic that, let's forget about Repression, especially as Repression was a dead end, it was hopeless. So let's move to the project that also existed, and let's create a Jewish republic in the Crimea. And it was somehow how they come with this idea. And of course, information was available about the origins of this idea, that it comes from the United States. It comes from the Jewish circles of the United States. And of course, all of these ideas and all these notions of a Jewish conspiracy linked together with imperialistic some forces all over the world, capitalist and so on. So this was the main reason for persecuting eventually the members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. Too much initiative. Apart from the idea of establishing a sort of a statehood in the Soviet Union, the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee began to play increasingly a role of the only address that just a Soviet Jewish person could send a letter to, sharing some problems or asking to help. A very common problem was people who survived and were trying to come back to their places. They would come and find that their apartment or their house was already populated or had different residents. And quite often they were not welcome, really, with this coming back. And this sort of letters sent to the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, and quite often the committee was able to help such people. And if we recall the original purpose, the original idea or brief for this committee to be just a propaganda unit, to move to representing Jewish interests, to move to the idea of creating a Jewish statehood, because it was dangerous. The question is, were they crazy? They, Peretz Markish, Michoels, and so on, they were Soviet people. Soviet people who lived, many of them, almost all of them, who lived in Moscow, and who was integrated into the mainstream. Very experienced people, but very, again, I repeat, very Soviet people. And they knew, of course, that the initiative was punishable and so on. Why did they do it? The question is, this is a huge question, because after doing it, they were essentially doomed. The question was simply when and how. Were they doomed to survive, or they would end up in the Gulag, in the labor camps, or they would be executed, or whatever. This was the question. They knew it, but at the same time, and it was not only among the members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, it was characteristic of the general climate in intellectual circles, Soviet intellectual circles of the time. There was a belief that as a result of the war, as a result of the victory during it, the climate in the Soviet Union was becoming different. They really believed. They really believed that in the 30s, on the eve of the war, it was important to do what Stalin and his apparatus was doing, to purge, to prepare the country, to get rid of anyone who was questionable on the eve of the war. They really believed that somehow they justified it or rationalized it. But after the victory, after the success, and after creating a whole group of satellites, and coming out so strong in military terms, and strong, of course, in the terms of being simply successful psychologically, to have such a support in the West, in various things. So they believed that in the new state, in this reform state, or how they believed that this state would be reformed, it was possible to not only to dream in a kitchen among, in a circle of very close friends, but also that it was kosher to write a letter to Stalin, it was kosher to come with an initiative. Of course, they were mistaken. And this August 1952 was a product of this tragic mistake. So this is what I see, and many historians nowadays see as more or less the reason of the persecutions, of the liquidation of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, physical liquidation of its leading members. Again, as a bottom line, they were writers. The 5 most significant writers at the time in the Soviet Union, and I'll repeat their name: David Bertelson, David Hofstein, Peretz Markish, in Russian he's Lev Kvitka, and whom I forgot. It's thank you. They were writers, but they were executed, they were arrested and executed mainly not for their writings, but as people of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, people of a group that by the end of its existence as a committee, they had some hopes that couldn't be realized in the Soviet Union. Thank you. For questions.
We've got 5 minutes, just 5 minutes for questions to Gennady.
Quick question. When was Mikhail's traffic accident arranged? That was probably the same thing.
No, it was arranged, yeah. So the question is when the timing of Solomon Mikhail's this traffic accident, yeah, actually the murder of Solomon Mikhail's. It was on the 13th of January 1948, during his history.
But the real question I had was the Soviet doctor's plot. Was that related to this issue, or? In a
sense, yes and no. No. It's a great question, because we still know relatively little. This is remarkable. A lot of scholarship invested in this whole thing, but still there are huge questions. And one of them is this: was it really? It's very easy in general to answer the questions. Stalin was horrible. He was against Jews, and as a result, yeah. But in the reality, it's not like an explanation. We don't know exactly what Stalin had on his mind and so on. And what was really anti-Semitic and what was really something else. Because if we put into the general context, and I'm not trying, of course, to whitewash Stalin, if we put into the general context, it's one thing when we read only about Jewish-related things. But when we read about general context, read one of the recent Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands or whatever, we find that actually Jews came out from Stalinist repressions, ironically, with proportionally less significant losses in human life than, say, the Poles, than, say, the Ukrainians, than, say, many other ethnic groups in the Soviet Union. This is also a very tragic, and but I'll mention it, footnote to this whole. When the repressions started in the 30s, up to 40% of top officers and generals of the secret police responsible for the repression were Jewish. Later they were also, they became victims of this whole machinery of repressions. But this was the case. So in the general context, we still have numerous questions to understand how Jewish and how non-Jewish.
So 2 questions, and I think that might have to be it. I'm sorry, Dave. The person in the front, and then the person.
That was my question.
You partly answered what I wanted to reply. But would you say that this was primarily an organisational matter on the part of the Soviet authorities, and that anti-Jewish feeling was not a primary motivation?
There were strong anti-Jewish feelings, it's an open secret, at that time in the Soviet Union in general. From the war, the Soviet Union came out more anti-Semitic, at least on the surface, than it was on the surface before the war. We don't know exactly what was the real situation, because we know that before the war, anti-Semitism, or at least some open things anti-Semitic, were suppressed severely in the Soviet Union. There were people who were persecuted. My father graduated from a Yiddish department at a pedagogical university, told me a story how his friend who was Jewish was expelled from the university for being anti-Semitic. Because he wrote on the desk Zid, K, or Kaik. And as a result, for writing Kaik, though he was Jewish, he was expelled from the university. Yeah? So it was suppressed. During the war, the situation became different, and from the war, it's a long story, I can give a whole lecture about this. And after the war, of course, anti-Semitic feelings were strong. Whether the case of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee was a product of this feeling, it's a different story, and it's one of the question marks that remain here. It's to other scholars, future scholars